Welcome to the Think Forward Show. Let's explore the future together.
Welcome to the Think Forward Show. Today, we're diving into the fascinating realm of disruptive futures with a guest who's been literally everywhere in the future space these past few years. Roger Spitz isn't your typical futurist. He comes to the field from a completely different angle as the former global head of Tech M&A, who made a bold pivot into professional futures work. Roger founded the Disruptive Futures Institute and wrote the acclaimed book, Disrupt with Impact. It's where he introduces a game-changing framework called the triple approach. It stands for anti-fragile, anticipatory, and agility. While most of us futurists talk about technology disruption, Roger takes a broader view, focusing on systemic changes and meta-eruptions that are reshaping our world at an unprecedented pace. From his unique global perspective, having lived in 9 different countries by age 18, to his unconventional study of improv comedy to enhance his futures thinking, Roger brings a refreshingly different approach to navigating uncertainty. We'll explore how his financial background gives him a special insight into board-level decision-making, sustainable futures, and how organizations can help develop futures intelligence as an operating system for the 21st century. So get ready for a mind-expanding journey where we'll discover why unprecedented is becoming the norm and how you can prepare your organization to thrive amid this constant disruption. This is episode 132. Disruptive Futures with Roger Spitz. Roger, welcome to the show.
Hey, Steve. Great to be on. Thanks for having me.
So, Roger, you've been, seems to be everywhere these last few years. You and I met at the University of Houston Foresight program, and I've just seen your just trajectory has just been awesome. You know, you really kind of captured a part of the space. You know, I talked to a lot of designers, talked to a lot of different futurists, innovators, different parts of the field. You come at it from a finance background and economics, but a lot of people may not know who you are. So why don't you let's just start kind of with your journey. Like, how do you go from being like a global head of tech and in Tech M&A to being a futurist? You know, you're focused on systemic disruption. So how does that kind of, you know, accidental futurist journey come about?
Yeah, no, good point. It's probably not super common of the different things. I'm not sure there are many or any ex-M&A bankers that are kind of professionally qualified futurists or what have you. I kind of stumbled upon it and then connected the dots in certain ways that seemed to make sense for me. I was interested in various things other than the city and banking and finance. Initially, I was interested in philosophy and various things at school. In the French educational system, which I did a few years of, it's broader than just kind of, you know, sometimes the US or UK. So I did study philosophy and all that at a very basic level. But at some point, one has to make choices. And certainly when you go, I was in London, when you go to move into investment banking, like, you know, from your own consultancy work and that, it's 200%, right? You have very little, if no time for anything. So at that point, you make choices. You sell, you know, there's a nice book and opera and everything called Faust about that. And it was, you know, these are good professions, and M&A is quite forward looking, and you're thinking about the future. I was global head of M&A covering tech, so advising CEOs, boards, and investors on their most strategic divestments or acquisitions, covering it globally, initially in London. And in 2017, I was asked to sort of reinforce and kind of develop the team in San Francisco. And I promised myself to go down the rabbit hole of things that that I was starting to notice. And the main thing was what was keeping clients up at night was no longer the conventional playbooks or cookie cutter strategy or market share or what have you. It was something which I call disruption. It's not a word I like, although I haven't found a better one, so I do use it. But and we'll come back to it. But it's really nonlinear, complex change. It's systemic disruption. It's something else which, over the past 5-10 years, I think has exacerbated, although that's a negative connotation, but has kind of reinforced. And I decided to go down that rabbit hole of change. So indeed, we met at Houston. I had another course in Foresight as Institute for the Future. I did some courses at Santa Fe Institute of Complexity, courses on stand-up comedy and things like that, courses at the D School in Stanford on design thinking and AI and strategy. And I basically did 10 to 12 micro-learning courses over a period of 4 or 5 years when I moved to the US in 2017. And at some point, I realized two things. One is that things were changing a lot, and probably the assumption the world was making of a stable, linear, predictable, controllable world, not only was that assumption wrong, but that the cost of relying on that assumption was increasing for humanity, for companies, for countries. And that's basically one realization. The second realization is I felt that I was very interested in these topics and that carving out 10% of my time didn't cut it anymore. So I took the brave or stupid decision to professionalize it a few years ago, to move full time into spending time thinking about these topics, writing about it, and what have you. And we can unpack that and the journey since. But that effectively is kind of the trigger and inflection point, if that makes sense.
For those who are listening, along those micro-learning things, you mentioned you did a comedy. So you usually get I did the business education or the futures courses or this or that. But I think you're the first one that mentioned comedy or improv. So can you explain that and why and how it's benefited you, especially public speaking too? I would gather. So,
yeah, these are great interventions. Well, or whatever the word is. Yeah, no, and like a reaction or no, you're right. Maybe it is an intervention, but no, the thinking was the following. In Silicon Valley and many places, when you think about change or disruption, you immediately bring it down to technocentric product, innovation, or technology. And it's something which is understandable, which is replicable, which is discrete. And we can talk about that separately. And I was sensing that the changes that I was observing were much broader. And I was interested in taking different vantage points and benefiting from different vantage points around change. And stand-up comedy or improv are different aspects of looking at surprise, at discontinuity. And I thought that it would be interesting to add that to the various ways of perceiving and experiencing change. More specifically, when I did the D School in Stanford, I did a 1-week executive education. Again, these are not real degrees or anything. This is like, micro learning and dabbling and just planting seeds to then connect the dots on that. But in D School, I was very lucky to have, and also at Singularity University, I did an executive program. I was very lucky to have a professor from Stanford on improv. And I did a few hours, no big deal. But I just thought it'd be interesting to do a bit more of that in a more structured way. And you're right, it helps with public speaking, although in investment banking, you're quite familiar with that, but it kind of broadens it. It helps with thinking about discontinuity and change and disruption, for want of a better word. It helps how you respond and the yes and mindset. And it really brings a lot of things together. And the most interesting thing for me, maybe, and we'll unpack that with maybe some other topics around our work and that, is improv intuitively, when you first think about it, or for me anyway, I imagine that it was something which was completely, you can't practice it and it doesn't help with new situations because by definition it's novel and it's improvised. But what's interesting is that it has this kind of paradox and tension and contradiction, which is, yes, it's novel because it's improv, it's a new situation constantly. But by virtue of improvising more, you somehow get better versed at dealing with the unexpected and uncertainty. And I felt that actually the connection with foresight and with what's happening in the world and the areas of interest, it was extremely useful. I wouldn't say more than some other tools, but certainly up there in terms of relevance and usefulness.
Well, you had a recent keynote in Paris, and it's interesting you brought up the unexpected. You talked about how unprecedented is becoming the norm. I see COVID I would call that a major trigger because everyone had everything going along for decades, and then everything is completely just upended, and we realize how fragile things are. But is it always kind of in a state of unprecedented? I mean, obviously, look at the last few weeks when this is being taped about AI and DeepSeek in China. There's all kinds of things that just seem to be popping up. So could you unpack that a bit? Like how you think it's becoming that norm?
Yeah. So there are two aspects to it, I think. One is what is or isn't happening, and two is how one perceives it and reacts to it and prepares for it, right? I'll start with what I think is happening. What I think is happening is that we're in environments where things are are more systemic, more connected. There are different drivers to that, which we can unpack if we wish, and which create cascades which have more extremes, not just polarization, but just simply because they're exponential. It can be positive, it can be negative. It can be the speed with which you discover things or have great ideas. It's not necessarily a negative connotation per se, but effectively a combination of drivers of change, which we can unpack, are leading to what I see as constant change, cascading, greater speed and frequency of inflection points. And where things are systemic, so you can't separate a specific event. So, climate then leads to social, then can lead to wars, to lead to energy crisis, inflation, pandemics. And that basically, at some point, I think for society or decision makers or anyone, when you're reading about unprecedented, never happened before, daily for different things, you have to ask yourself whether you need to reframe the way we think about the meaning of unprecedented. Is rare becoming less rare? If extremes are becoming more common, what does it actually mean, the never happened before and unprecedented? Does it help with you prepare that it's just unlikely? And I think what's important for humanity is to observe that actually there's no such thing as being protected from these things. And therefore that leads you to, if you sort of think, okay, actually change is quite frequent and quite surprising and more so, maybe the issue is how you see the world. And then how you see the world will inform how you prepare for it and then how you respond to it. And maybe the issue is not necessarily per se what is happening in the world, but the way we see it, prepare for it and respond to it.
So you've lived in multiple parts of the world, and does that influence your perspective on this? Does it modify that versus those who maybe have just lived in the United States or lived in Europe or lived in, I don't know, China? How does it influence your perspective on things when you look at it?
We'll be back after a quick break.
Okay, a quick pause from the show. Are you preparing for the future or just hoping it doesn't catch you off guard? My new book, Super Shifts, is your guide to navigating the biggest transformations of our time: AI, automation, and the new world of work. And here's the deal. If you pre-order or grab your copy now, you'll get exclusive bonus content, including the behind-the-scenes look at what didn't make the final book. Stay tuned after the episode for details, but don't wait. Head to supershiftsbook.com and get your copy today. Now back to the show.
I think there are two aspects which for me were instrumental. I can't, comment on how it might help others, but for me, there are two aspects that were instrumental. I think one is the specific fragments of life and lived experience, which may potentially be more varied through broader exposure. So whether it's Africa, Western Europe, some aspects of Asia, in terms of philosophy, in terms of mindset, in terms of cultural references, in terms of just accepting that things are different, etc. So there's the lived experience of what you observe and the dots you may or may not connect. And then the other thing I think, and this is probably builds on that and is pretty fundamental, is that in a way change is a constant, because I lived in probably 8 or 9 countries by the time I was 18. And nothing horrendous. I mean, I wasn't a victim of anything. I just had a father that was very international and doing well, and, absolutely nothing untoward. But it does mean that, when you're 8 and you have to move schools and completely country and lose all your friends and build from scratch and go to a place with a different language, you adapt differently. You see change in a different way. You might connect things in a different way in terms of the read across. So I think that in environments where I believe that change is a constant and systemic, and that the varied experiences, whether it's living in different places or changing ecosystems or whatever it is, there are many ways of achieving the same thing, are probably helpful in terms of, dealing with the linear way. As humans, we don't like change. We like things that are quite predictable, etc. I'm not saying that it makes you like them, but you're certainly more used to dealing with them, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, you moved a lot. I mean, that disruptive to a child, especially just, making friends, getting, social circles and things like that. But at the same time, you now have a global perspective that many children do not and would not by the time you were, time for university. I mean, what are the major places that you moved that you were kind of remember the most that kind of had an impact on you? I mean, there's a lot of places I know you did, but what are some big ones?
Yeah, I think I left South Africa at the age of 6, and my father moved back there. He passed away a few years ago, but he had moved back there. Our parents divorced, and so I'd spent the past 15 years reconnecting with South Africa, going there yearly at least, and that. And I think there's a part of Africa which is very important. First of all, for most of people, just knowing it exists and the virtues of it and the amazing richness and all aspects, but then culturally, and then whether it's music or philosophy or just a million things, art, the humanity of it, the potentiality, even from a business perspective, and that, and of course the sadness and things one sees and the tensions and that. And then I didn't spend tons of time in India, but it kind of influenced me a lot also with Asia, just through my visits and exposure in different places, which weren't necessarily Asia, was Zen Buddhism and some of the Indian philosophy and Sanskrit. And I think those are kind of also linked to change and different perceptions on change and transience and that. And I spent a lot of time in France as well. And of course, there's some stereotypes you have of France. But as a kid, for me, one of the biggest things was the educational system, right? Because you spend a lot of time at school. And when you're asked to, when you're at school in Houston, which I was at the age of 8 or 9, and you're asked to do a multiple choice set of questions and spend all Wednesday on a baseball field, it's not the same as having to write a 4-hour essay on God is dead comment or something like that.
I was going to say, can you contrast Voltaire and Rousseau and the Enlightenment? It's like
exactly.
Can you tell me the inner workings of Dumas's both the Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo? Kind of, I can imagine as a kid that would be like, no,
I know.
I think it would be fun, but I'm not, it's not for a 12-year-old probably. But it's interesting you bring up those are very particular countries. I've personally been to them, and I love South Africa, and I spent a good deal of time there. And you're right, there's such a tapestry of different history. You think about the thousands of years that even the French country as a nation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's changing borders, but how that changed. But your the work you've done, and why does someone say like, I must start an institute? Like, I'm going to just start an institute. What motivates you to? You have the Disruptive Futures Institute, TFI. Like, so what for you is this? What was that drive? Like, you've got this background, you've got all this experience, and you've seen all these things, and you're like, did it just kind of come to you? Just where did that kind of like, what's driving you, right? What is the calling to do that or something?
Yeah. So there are a few things, and I'm just going to make one wrap-up comment on the different cultures because something quite interesting, which then feeds into your question now and some other things is, of course, in France you have some of the stereotypes and that, which many of which are true and justified around food or culture or intellectualism, etc. But one of the things in particular for me, which was striking, was it allowed me to get exposure to existential philosophy. And existential philosophy is one where you sort of prime, in particular Jean-Paul Sartre, and we can talk about that later, existentialism, prime, agency, freedom, and choice, and the agency you have, you exist and you create yourself. And so that strong sense of agency is something which I've kind of felt very assimilated to. And coming back to your question around why do you, what was the impetus to suddenly start Disruptive Futures Institute, or what was the vocation, or what have you? When I went through that rabbit hole around different micro learning, and I took the decision to move out of investment banking. I mean, investment banking, as you know, these are pretty good, well-paid jobs. And these are sort of what, Bezos calls one-way doors, right? You don't kind of leave M&A after 20 years and just pitch back up a few years later because you think, it was actually quite good. So when you move, you think about it very hard. But one of the reasons I decided to move is because one, I earned okay, although I still needed to earn a living and be sustainable. It's one thing to have some savings, another thing to live for decades on end and that. So I needed something that I thought I could make a living out of. But I saw a gap when I went through that rabbit hole and that micro learning. I thought the courses I did were all extraordinary, but I saw a gap. I saw the gap, which is the following. One, which is they were quite specialized. It's interesting because, things like foresight are multidisciplinary, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily connecting the dots and that they're really transdisciplinary and that they're sort of capacity building for a particular way of thinking. They're still relying on specific playbooks, and interdisciplinary doesn't necessarily mean transdisciplinary. And then the other thing is, I wasn't always, so they were a bit specialized, and then there was a so what question. What do I do about it? So I think foresight and futures is a bit different. I think there's a lot of very important tools in that, but some others not necessarily. But I still think even when they're multidisciplinary, some of these can be slightly dogmatic. In other words, this is the playbook, this is how to think as a futurist, or how to do design thinking, or how to do whatever. And I felt that in the world which I perceived it as constantly changing, where pretty much the whole world was making the wrong assumptions, relying on them, and that the cost of relying on those wrong assumptions was going to increase, I felt that you needed a new operating system. You needed a new operating system in terms of how to make sense of the world, how to make decisions. And that was from a governance perspective, boards, to strategic, to energy transition. It's, to really pretty much to education, to everything. And once you think systemically, none of this is separated anyway, as you know very, even better than me. So I saw this gap for a system of content from education to publications, to executive programs, to thought leadership, to basically, help the world with new paradigms, knowing that both leadership programs, incentives, governance structures, and education were failing humanity in terms of what it is to be relevant in the 21st century. And I'm not saying that alone and that the Institute is able to address that, but I did feel that the potentiality of it was important, both in terms of what the world really needs and aligning with interests I have, as well as areas I thought I had a point of view and could contribute, as well as something which had a business potential. So it was reconciling sort of, what does the world need? What interests, it's the ikigai. What does the world need? What interests me? And what can I be paid for? I forget the three, elements of the ikigai. And
What's, interesting is that you mentioned, and I've had this conversation, and it's a couple of different episodes with different people, and there's a upcoming episode with Dr. Alex Fergnani, or maybe one that would already been out there, is we talk about the difference between futures and foresight. You mentioned that. Like, what do you see as the difference between that? And I think people use them kind of interchangeably. And then I think more academia, they try and differentiate that. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I know some people try to be quite structured and academic around distinctions and that, and I don't intend to at all. But I would say that futures thinking, in terms of futures intelligence, in terms of being future prepared and building resiliency, is really a capacity and an operating system, and it can take absolutely any shape, and it doesn't rely just on the future studies of foresight per se. That's why we can talk about it if you wish. I have things like the AAA and things which are not just relying on foresight. I think foresight, in my interpretation of it, tends to be slightly more structured, slightly more specific, tools which we're drawing on, often around scenario building, often around strategy, sometimes on a sort of institutional or corporate plane, than necessarily individual. Whereas I really think that there's a capacity building and an operating system and a futures intelligence which helps one be future prepared, future savvy, and build resiliency for shocks as well as seeing gaps, which may not necessarily fit in a specific box around certain of the foresight tools or approaches per se. But listen, I know it's a live debate even within the field and outside, and most people, don't care or don't know. But anyway.
Yeah, I always differentiated futures and foresight as research and thinking, or theory, to application, like use, right? And different kinds of foresight. But you have within the DFI and with your book, you've got some really interesting frameworks, and I think people should be if they're not aware of them already, I think it'd be really great to just kind of get a little nerdy for a minute, kind of talk about some of the terms you've kind of coined, which are being used in a lot more places. I think the term meta-eruptions, it's like could you kind of go in that, like, because I know you've linked it to like megatrends and things like that, but it's like, how do you differentiate? Like, it's an interesting term, especially in the world. Yeah.
Thanks for picking up on that. And listen, we all have, again, it boils down to language and semantics and perceptions. But the way I kind of thought about it is, initially when I entered the futures field, I felt that the big aha moment and distinction, which was extremely valuable and still is, it's really the difference between, strong signals and weaker signals, and, horizon scanning versus environmental scanning, so the horizon being broader and you're trying to pick up very specific early signals and that. And then you move to performing a view and building different plausible scenarios, and all that is extremely essential and frames how I think a lot on that. And in that, I was trying to kind of think for myself the connection between the signals, whether stronger or weaker, the trends, and what we do with that. And I know that in the futures field, we consider trends to just be the starting point, and because they evolve, and once they're already trends, it's not necessarily the same as a scenario, which should be more surprising than just the trend. So I got all that, but I still felt that when you look at, I think it was John Naisbitt in 82 on the 80s that wrote mega trends, and then there's also some terms like meta trends. And when I was reading those books for myself and looking at the definitions and how it was used, I felt that there were three things that were entailed in mega trends or meta trends, even though they were not trends. I felt, first of all, they were still somehow derived from the past and to a degree extrapolating the history and the future in terms of a direction and trajectory, because you're aggregating a number of things and putting a label on it. And that kind of said, oh, okay, this is what is going to happen, but it's just a broader category as opposed to just a specific trend or what have you. The second thing is that I felt that these mega trends or meta trends, in the way I read them, and again, might be a misinterpretation at my end, is that even when they're unrelated, the individual constituents or the different mega trends, the way they're presented and used is often on the basis that they will interact in a predictable manner. So you bundle them, you kind of project some direction that will probably continue, and then you consider that a bit like the risk, like if you take the 10 biggest risks or the World Economic Forum risk reports and that, these are very substantial, real, relevant, etc. But the real trick is how do they interact and what that creates. And the fact that you kind of have them in a sort of siloed and specific way might give the impression that you can just take them one by one and look at the ramifications of them in their own right, each mega trend or meta trend. And the third element is that they don't necessarily take, to my mind, the second or third order implications of change. So when you look at the black jellyfish and some other things, we all know that and I know that a mega trend is already meant to embed some next degree implications, but with the understanding we have at that point in time, at some point, you don't know how it unfolds to second or third order implications. So long story short, I felt that in the end, it was slightly a little bit like looking in the back rearview mirror. Once you could define it, articulate it, understand the implications, project it, understand the ecosystems, put labels on it, I felt that gave some degree of continuity that was probably greater than the reality of our world where change is a constant. And so to contrast it, I put a lot of emphasis in our work on systemic disruption. I just felt, well, maybe it's meta-eruptions. Maybe it is often surprising. Rare is, as we discussed earlier, becoming less rare. Never happened before, etc., is happening quite a lot. And maybe that's what meta-eruptions are. Maybe we should think about not labeling what a meta-eruption is. Now, don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean that there aren't things in the future that will continue. I mean, I still believe in the three laws or what have you, things that are in the present and will continue in the future. Then the third thing is there'll be new things and things will drop. So I'm not suggesting that there isn't value in history and in some understanding of fundamental drivers, but that is in parallel to meta-eruptions, and the meta-eruptions might dominate what stays absolutely the same and constant. And so I felt that it was potentially a healthier way than the obsession we all have at the beginning of the year of thinking what are the latest meta trends and what does that mean, and just taking those as kind of that will help me derive my strategy. No, maybe to help you derive the strategy should be change as a constant. Yes, there's certain things that are probably kind of safer than others to assume some degree of continuity. Anyway, that was kind of the rationale around that.
It's really good because it links to, I think when you and I you were first starting out with this and you kind of launched DFI, one of your first things out of the gate was the AAA framework, was anti-fragile, anticipatory, and agility. I remember that because I was like, that's clever. AAA. I'm like, why didn't they come up? Why hasn't anybody talked about AAA? I was like, because everyone's got a framework. There's so many things out there. Everyone's kind of got their approaches to it. But because of your economics background and your finance background, I thought it was interesting because instead of kind of the tech futurist route, or even I'm a design futurist. So I'm looking about how to synthesize, prototype. Like I want to help people touch, taste, feel it. What I love about your approach is that you really get into the boardroom. Like people are like the anti-fragility message, people are just really trying to deal with digital transformation initiatives. They're trying to deal with, constantly shifting sand and how it happens. And this really goes to the heart of it. And I think it's a really resonant message. Where did you kind of, where did that come? I've always wanted to ask you, like, where that kind of came from. Where did it incubate in your brain? Did you see things happen? Did it, like, you just explained it really beautifully about meta-eruptions. Like, did it just kind of pop in your head? Were you just playing with words? Like, where did that really come into play for you?
Yeah, like many things, it's a journey, right? And then at some point you connect the dots. And AAA came afterwards in terms of the labeling, and I discovered to my horror that there were 8 million AAA frameworks of some sort out there. But no, I know what you mean.
In the model of, like, in the futures, foresight, innovate, kind of this part of the space. Yeah, there's AAA everywhere. I'm going to use AAA if I get my tire goes flat. But in terms of, like, everyone's got this method or that method. I just thought it was fresh. It was fresh. It's just kind of, it was a really nice framing.
So I literally spent probably, let's call it half a decade reading and a million things and doing the micro learning and all that in a concentrated way. Not that others don't in that. But one thing that I think there was actually an inflection point, if I had to label it, when I started doing a few courses on foresight and futures, where I thought the field was a little bit dogmatic in terms of, those who believe, you do scenarios and long-term planning, and those who believe it's emergence and no criticism, because these are phenomenal brains and academics and better than I'll ever be, but who believe very firmly around, like take the Kinnavan framework with Dave Snowden or Real Miller. It's very much emergence, serendipity, and how to manage that. And nothing wrong with that. These are frameworks I abide by, and the uses are infinite. But what I didn't fully understand, and it took me time to grapple with it, is why did we sometimes need to have either or? Why was it sort of, did we, not just this field, but why is it sort of, more emergent and complex systems and this, and therefore you shouldn't bother about scenarios because it's too long term, or therefore, you should think more about scenarios and we spend less time worrying about the here and now because only the present exists. And that is something I was just struggling with in my mind in some of the master's course, some of the modules of the master's courses and others. I just struggled with that. And then the other thing is, if I come to kind of our discussion around meta-eruptions, it's fine to tell people, listen, it's all unpredictable. Anything can happen, enjoy life. It's like, well, okay, but what do you do about that? How do you build that in? Because, you can't prepare for that. So what does it mean? And so long story short, it meant for me in my mind 3 things. It meant these are not either or decisions. First of all, you need foundations that are resilient or maybe even better to shocks because you can't predict. It's unpredictable for some of it. You need that. And therefore, having read Nassim Taleb's 5 volumes of Concerto and focusing in particular on anti-fragility, I thought that makes sense. Those are the foundations. We need to find ways of applying, whether it's institutions, companies, your personal life, some degree of resiliency or even maybe better. And you need anti-fragile foundations. You don't know what happens. Simple as that. And that's not necessarily foresight or futures or anything. It's just Nassim Taleb's anti-fragility. And then I thought it's useful to think long term. It's useful to do visioning. It's useful to for all the reasons we know, and for you and I having studied all this and applying it and being interested in it, it has a million uses which we can talk about. But there is legitimacy in the debate of only the present exists and the here and now and the emergent, in the unknown and how do you respond. And somehow I felt you needed something to reconcile the long-term thinking with the here and now. It wasn't necessarily just apply this OODA loop or whatever, feedback loop framework, or it was something else. And in my mind, I thought, well, so thinking long-term is anticipatory. The foundations are anti-fragile you need, and you need that cognitive, strategic, and emergent agility to reconcile that long-term future with the here and now, because only the present exists. And that's where I kind of thought of agility. You need that agility, which I don't use in the design sense or another word that's used in many different contexts. For me, agility is cognitive, emergent, and strategic agility to reconcile the longer-term visioning with the here and now. How do I make decisions? How do I use OODA loops, feedback loops, Kinven frameworks, different things that are emergent in the here and now, not to the exclusion of long-term thinking and scenarios and the anticipatory? And how do I make sure that I have the right foundations so that whatever happens because of meta-eruptions and the world, basically it's okay, it doesn't matter. And not only does it not matter, but maybe you can strengthen and benefit from that. And so that's effectively why I thought AAA is anticipatory and anti-fragile and agility. And then I thought of 2 enablers to be AAA plus, what we call being AAA plus, which is, I spoke earlier about agency and existentialist philosophy and that. And I sort of thought, having the right foundations and all that, it doesn't really necessarily, or thinking longer term, or it doesn't necessarily help unless you have the agency to exercise it. It's like an option. Unless you exercise it and do something and have the agency, it's worth nothing, that option. So I thought agency was important as an enabler. So it's like a 4th A in a way, and alignment. It doesn't mean that you need to agree with everyone. You need dissonance and disagreements to kind of be, think of new ways of doing things, etc. But somehow you need enough alignment for it not to be polarized and dysfunctional. And so I sort of thought that's a AAA framework. Anticipatory foundations, anti-fragile foundations, anticipatory, the agility to reconcile the longer term with the short term, and then the 2 enablers, or you need agency and some alignment for the AAA to be of any value and effective.
That's great. I mean, it leads me to kind of the book, which you released a few months ago. But you mentioned Jean-Paul Sartre, and all the other existentialists, which is, you use the term texistentialism, which is another nice fusion. And so let's talk about the book. So, and give it that term as well. So where did the kind of, you speak a lot, work with a lot of clients. Did the book kind of organically evolve? You're like, I must kind of put all this together so that people can consume it that maybe couldn't bring me in. You wanted to kind of democratize it, evangelize it. Where did the idea for the book come, and what's it about? When we start with that, what's the title in the book, what it's about, and where did it come from?
Yeah. So the title of the book is Disrupt with Impact, Achieve Business Success in an Unpredictable World. Disrupt, again, is not used necessarily in the technocentric sense. It's really just change, either just the status quo as it is for humanity or for what have you, to get out of our most complex challenges, the status quo is probably not going to fly. So the idea of disrupt is we need to drive change and be able to sustain change, whether we like it or not. Unless people, we feel the status quo as it is in the world is great, but I personally don't. So you need to change. And with impact, it needs to be effective. You can't have just change for change. Like it or not, many things that one does, even well-intentioned, are just simply not effective. So disrupt with impact simply means that. How do you drive change in an effective manner? And then achieve business success in an unpredictable world. It comes back to the meta-eruption. Business is because, like all publishers, they kind of put you in a box, and so that they felt was more of a business book. I personally like to think of it as more smart thinking and broader and applicable to anyone. But effectively, that's the name of the book. Now, maybe just as a kind of brief intro, I introduced my personal life and the Institute. But basically, I have a foresight practice called Tech Essential, which is foresight advice. I work with organizations, the decision makers, and that is advisory. It's real world. It's every day I'm on situations. And then the Institute, the Disruptive Futures Institute, is content, education, etc. And the two inform each other. So the idea is that I think we should never be disconnected. I think anybody who works in these fields and interacts should have real world practical case studies and feedback loops and see what works, doesn't work, whether people use it. And I was fortunate a few years ago when I started the Institute and with the pandemic and all that there was a lot of demand for our courses. And so I had written 4 volumes, quite detailed, slightly arrogantly called The Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption. There were 4 volumes, one on frameworks, one on, etc. And that was all B2B. It was all enterprise, corporate, doing very well. It still is. It's scaling like crazy. And it helps build capacity for futures intelligence and resiliency with organizations and driving change, etc. But during that journey, which continues, I constantly get interest and a lot of following from individuals. And so this book was basically a way of kind of updating some of the ideas, putting some of the real world case studies, introducing what we call the disruptive thinking canvas in a way which, if people are interested, they can get it for $20 or whatever it is, as opposed to having to spend the time or the money on executive education programs if their company, because we don't today have a B2C program offering. We get a lot of demand and we'll launch it within the next 12, 18 months. And we're doing one in Brazil on climate, but we don't today have much B2C. And a book is a way of, to your point, democratizing it, sharing the ideas and that. The important thing for me is really the kind of that it's applied, that it's, there's nothing there that isn't from my experience, from situations we get involved in, from advice we've given, from mistakes we made. It's most of it is kind of, fed from concrete real world case studies and things that you can, touch and feel.
The audience for this book is it really B2B? Is it anybody, like, is it futurists? Is it anybody in the business executive space? Like, who would be the targets that really you think this has appeal? It has appeal to, or you think it's designed to?
So deep down, it's everybody. It's 8 billion people, because the fundamentals. 8 billion people is not a bad market. Doesn't mean you. Even $1 or $2 per person is not a bad market for some. But the fundamentals of building resiliency, being future prepared, are essential for everyone. And I think that whether you're an organization, institution, personal, thinking about your career, most people need some way of reconciling. It's not a bad word to realize that we need to have some monetary exchange or value to earn money. Unfortunately, that is the world we live in. So most people, even if you're an individual, a kid at school, just thinking about careers or anything, you need to think about how is the world, what opportunities are there, where's the world going? These for me are all fundamental. And the business in the label achieve business success is just because publishers, push you into a particular box. So there are slightly more examples and case studies that have business applications. But the way I approach the writing and the interest I've seen, more importantly, people bought in that, has been pretty broad. I mean, I have a lot of people I know who said that, I bought it for my friends, or I gave it to a student, or I read it for this. And the reviews, I was, very pleased with the reviews. Also seem to recognize that it is not another book on disruption, innovation, product development, or Silicon Valley kind of 10 books a day kind of thing. They see that it's broad and more applicable to really what it is to stay relevant in today's world, for the better and the worse.
You mentioned in this, explaining the book, explaining the courses, that you're doing something in Brazil around sustainable futures. I know it's a rapidly growing space. I think in the last 2 years, especially, I think the ESG has kind of burned everybody out because of the requirement. But the core essence of it is using anticipatory and participatory foresight methods, futures methods. What do you see as this kind of intersection between we'll call it climate foresight and the business strategy? Is this a kind of a more accessible way instead of this hard kind of nosed ESG thing, which I think is really gone from the message?
Yeah.
So explain, can you break that down? People like sustainable futures, I think maybe people well, isn't everything, wouldn't it be naturally sustainable? But this is a bit different in that.
Yeah. No, listen, I mean, these are extremely important topics, and especially in today's kind of environment, political and these are funny and very challenging times. So let me take a step back and mention one or two things. I should have maybe mentioned that around the book. So the book, there are four main sections. One is, why is change different today? Change has always existed. Why is it different today? The second run is around systems innovation and transformative change, and that's where climate fits in, and we'll talk about it in a minute. So, what is systems innovation and transformative change? The third aspect is really the future of decision-making, AI, and technology. And here, when I say the future of decision-making, I'm not meaning to algorithmize decision-making. On the contrary, I'm thinking about what humanity needs to do to stay relevant and to make decisions and not delegate to machines. So the future of decision-making and AI. And then the final section is really what we call the disruptive thinking canvas. Now, to your question on sustainability and sustainable futures and that, you're right. It's one of those terrible situations where, 50 years ago when the limits of growth and all these books came out, and they were kind of, killed by the think tanks and oil and gas industry and everyone to discredit it. It was easy for the world to, unfortunately, to kill because it wasn't tangible enough. People did not notice it, see it, relate to it. There was no legislation forcing organizations to do anything. So you could kind of just sort of say, rubbish. Now, what happens over the past 10, 15 years was encouraging. You had, the big investment funds, the BlackRocks and others that were sort of, the Paris Accord sort of saying, no, it's serious. People are starting to relate to it more. It's more tangible. And so the urgency is there. It's kind of burning, but you don't notice it in your backyard, but it's kind of hard to dismiss. And then indeed, over the past, year or two for some things and past week for other things, it's almost been it's a U-turn. It's the world's completely blind to the existential reality of some of these, existential risks, not least climate and biodiversity and that. My hope and my personal view is that two things. One is that, and I was in LA when the fires broke up. Once you start reading about something, and I wasn't directly affected or anything, but just it's still, you see things in different light. Once you read about potential threats, and then you see it on TV, and then it's in some whatever country, and then you're the one filming it on your iPhone or seeing it from your kitchen, you kind of start seeing things in a slightly different way, and when it's your house that's affected, and where your kids are going to school, etc. So I think, even though we have a problem with disinformation and denialism and some of our leaders, unfortunately, and corporates, my hope is that the reality is that it's so urgent and burning, pun intended, that somehow you can't not do anything. The second hope, and this is the focus on the book, is that you can have sustainable value creation. You can find ways of doing effectively, of driving change. That is a huge market because, sustainability will be the new digital. It already is. There is some legislation. Some legislation will stay. There'll be some requirements. And the world will need to transform the way it operates, the way it produces, the way it consumes in ways that are different. And it's not just going to be a tick the box ESG or whatever. It's going to be, I think, less news flow, yes, less fuss, but still fundamentally, it's not going to be acceptable to a lot of the customers who buy and that to just let companies do whatever they want. And there's a certain degree of scrutiny, etc. So my hope is that despite the, we often push things by extremes around certain things, rights and wokeism and etc. But things also swing back. And my hope is that even though we're at an extreme in terms of pushing back against regulation and, our current government in the US, etc., is that is not necessarily a reflection of the reality of some of the fundamental changes that I'm seeing take place. And so the only thing is that it just will take shape in a different way. It will create value in a different way. It will be enforced in a different way. There's certain choices that will be made differently. It will be communicated and shared in a different way, etc. But it doesn't mean that it's disappeared and that the world is off the hook in terms of both the urgency of the matter and what organizations will choose to do or need to do or be required to do to transition. So the sustainable futures is really thinking about some of the risks and challenges humanity has for which we have agency and the ability to change. We can't necessarily easily change an asteroid falling on us, although we do have technology to deflect a bit. But some of the risks, if there's a major earthquake or whatever, but some we really do have control, and we have less and less scope for mitigation for climate, but more and more scope for adaptation and resiliency. And so effectively, sustainable futures and climate foresight is thinking about what is anticipatory governance, what is it to be a bit more resilient in terms of adaptation for humanity, for cities, for buildings, for factories. How do you still create sustainable value, meaning you still create value in the sense that moves the world, whether we like it or not, which is, a capitalist world where people need to write checks and be prepared to invest in things, but in a way that is more likely to work in the longer term. Sustainability intentionally used both for climate, but also just simply sustainable over time, not a quick fix. Now, just to kind of wrap up very quickly on that, just to give a very concrete example of some of the work we're doing, and it's one of the topics in the book, is it's really looking at how do you drive change in complex systems. It's education, it's structures, governance, regulations, incentives, it's disclosures, it's the way you produce things. It's a number of things. You have different levers for change, as you know from the studies in systems thinking, and some are more effective than others. And there's a company, for instance, full disclosure in the south of Brazil, in Blumenau, called Lux Carbon Standard, which is the first carbon credit certifier in Brazil. And the carbon credit market, as you and many of your listeners will know, is a little bit dysfunctional today. There's, first of all, the belief that it doesn't serve any value because you're just kind of offsetting carbon. It doesn't mean it's actually effective in terms of supporting the energy transition. And then there's a lot of fraud because, unfortunately, there's fraud in many parts of the world, not only the Amazon and Brazil, but everywhere. And then if you're not pricing the assets properly, then the people who are buying the credits and can't trade them, they're liquid, they're dysfunctional. So it basically is a problem for all those sort of parts of the value chain. Now, this particular company started working with me 2 years ago, and they're building a higher integrity carbon credit certification. And the question they had, and the work I've been doing for the past few years, which we use as climate foresight or sustainable futures with them, is how do you apply those levers for change when you're not just trying to do something better yourself and the sort of conventional strategy, but where you're trying to transform the carbon markets. And basically, long story short, we went through exercises of looking at the futures wheels. What are the sort of possible next order implications of certain things happening? What are the stakeholder dynamics? In whose interest is it to drive change, to accept change? Who are the people who have the weight, not the weight, etc., in terms of decisions? We went through exercises around looking at the different levers for change, from education to structures to patterns to, where can we intervene and how, with what constituents, with the human and financial capital that the company has. It can't just do anything, right? It's not a government. It's not. And we took that on us, and we're seeing early ways of it working. And the objective is higher integrity carbon credit. So you're monitoring the projects after you've certified it. So if there's something untoward, people are aware of it. You have more scrutiny and care around the projects you take on. So there's less likely to be fraud. You're using some technology like blockchain for it to be transparent, and you can't tamper with the rights of the land. You're democratizing it, so it's more cost effective, and indigenous populations and others are cared for. They have an alternative to just selling to the biggest, highest bid of the land. They have an alternative that can monetize. You're working with the banks and the legislators on futures legislations. And this company has certified its initial credits. It has its own CCC protocol, which is a much higher integrity carbon standard. But most importantly, the world is paying attention. Brazil in December, weeks ago, just put through legislation, huge fundamental change in legislation around carbon credits and all these topics, which will force higher integrity along the lines of the things we're talking about. And basically, this is a concrete case where, Brazil will start having high integrity carbons, and the banks will be expecting that, and the trading markets and the buyers and sellers, and little by little, the whole world, because once you're changing one country and you're changing the market, no bank is going to accept to buy a carbon credit that's kind of dysfunctional, illiquid, and ill-priced, when they could have something of higher integrity. And then you bring in things like anti-fragility. We brought in the AAA framework. We worked with them with thinking about the AAA framework, like, they're doing like conservation and nature-based solutions in terms of just preservation. They're looking at some of the complex systems and the biospheres and the 6 biomes of Brazil. It's like, how do you do for the project so that you're not just preserving or ticking a box or making sure that you don't burn or deforest, but actually have that project benefit from the carbon credits? And what happens then is that once you start doing that, carbon credit offsets can be effective because they can be regenerative. And we all know that it's better not to pollute and emit carbons or have a factory that is sustainable and net zero, but that doesn't exist. And not everybody is going to replace the factories. So what happens is that countries will have regulation for certain targets of emissions. And the only way to get there will be that there will be some buffer which will be requiring carbon credit. So that will happen anyway. Companies and organizations will need to use that. So the question is, do you then have just to tick the box, or do you have something that might be effective? So anyway, it's a slightly long kind of story, but I hope it makes it more relatable in terms of some of the tools from Foresight and the AAA framework in terms of literally, and this is not the same as a dating app. You can write a $300 million check and sort of say, the best measurements for carbon or whatever. It's not the same as transforming a market in complex systems. And that's where you need to understand systems and foresight and do things differently from,
It's not, that's interesting. You like the way you use Tinder. It's like going to swipe right for a clean environment for
exactly.
You can't. No, your point is well taken, because a lot of times we'll talk about theory, or we'll talk about approaches in innovation, or just the way people think about things. But this is a really excellent. It's a real application of it, right? And then of your work, your book. And I think what it is in the innovation space and especially in the future space, we're looking at possible futures, right? There's things you can control. There's external factors, right? Regardless of your politics, or like here in America, we may take a regulation, but we can't control what China does. Like China might do things with their coal, and the atmosphere is going to be affected. It's going to drift this way. Like, how do we deal with that, right? If we do the things we do and the things we can control because people will make that in their purchasing decisions. They'll make it in their, obviously the shareholders and the things they're the values of the company. But at the same time, it's like the temperature may go up. I mean, it can be man-made things that we can't affect. There's can't change solar cycles. Like that's impossible. That's just the universe. And that can also so at the same time, if these possible futures or outcomes, how do we maneuver? And that speaks directly to futures and foresight. So I think it was a beautiful way you've explained that. And I think, as we kind of move toward, you really get through how leadership and how you can get into the what you would call the futures intelligence, but you have to build that muscle inside the organization in order to constantly not just bring someone like you or me in for the week or the month or there's an ongoing aspect to this, so your approach, I would love to kind of talk about kind of our, get into our kind of rapid fire thing, is looking ahead. What do you think, people should prepare for? I mean, there's so much to look at. I mean, sustainability. I mean, you've seen a broad spectrum. What do you think people should be really kind of taking the time right now to really, to use futures foresight work to prepare for?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I was, interested in the work I'm doing, not just from an economic perspective, but I have a deep conviction that we're at inflection points where, not without wanting to sound too kind of stereotypical cliche, where the future is now. And I think that when
I think what's happening is before things would happen slower, the rate of change would be slower, and we'd be able to have some retrospective look at it in terms of the impact or the extrapolation in possible futures. It is the window and the rapidity of it is, you feel it directly. So you're not wrong.
Yeah.
It's not like hyperbole. It is. I think anyone listening would definitely agree that things are shifting fast. Yeah.
And in that, for which 100%, there's the multiplicity, how systemic it is. So instead of having just the tech crash or COVID or financial crash, these are not isolated events. That's why our focus is so much on systemic disruption. And effectively, what it means is that future is now means, in a way, it's kind of both positive and negative. And one of the things about disruption and change and a lot of things we're talking about is actually the duality of it, right? And what I mean by that in terms of the future is now is that there's also things from the opportunity. I'm not the biggest fan of AI and techno, despite being in Silicon Valley and involved in some of these things. I see a lot of challenges with them. But yes, drug discovery is incredible, and AI platforms that can develop drugs in a few months as opposed to a few years is incredible. And there are potentiality for some incredible advancements around disease and around cures and around many things. And it's not an accident that DeepMind got a Nobel Prize in I forget what, chemical science or whatever, and because these intersections but at the same time, when it comes to, there's some existential and other risks with AI, and then there's climate, and then there's wars, and then there's nuclear, and all these things. So in the future of now, the good thing is that some of it is opportunity, and it raises the urgency. Humanity no longer has the option they had 50 years ago with the limits of growth to sort of park it, because you're seeing it every day in front of you. So that urgency, my hope is that while some of it is frightening, and a lot of it is frightening, is that it also forces the kind of agency, and to realize that we do have agency, and that we can actually drive virtuous tipping points. Tipping points don't have to be just negative. The same features that create inflection points can also be used for virtuous things. And anyway, so that would be the kind of message, if you ask me, for me.
No, that's great. It kind of makes me look also like when you started this, even your career, like what do you wish you knew? Like if you could tell your younger self, I always love, it's a question we hear a lot, but like what do you wish you knew when you started all this?
I think it's this thing about specialization and expertise. You know, for me, I come from a world where a lot of my family are academics and PhDs and professors and also practitioners. My father was a tax attorney, but I valued and I thought, you know, the more experience and expertise I developed, the more value. And more as I think more systemically and I think about the limitations of knowledge and what we don't necessarily know and emergence and unknown unknowns and that, the more I realized that, you know, to our earlier discussion on improv, that specialization and expertise is useful in certain configurations, but in many others is not actually of benefit. In unknown situations, what we call unvice, some special, you know, relying, it's not that it's not useful, it's just that you can't rely exclusively on specialization. And because to solve our complex unknown challenges, if we knew how to do it, we would have done it. And so you need new ways of thinking about things, and that is not coming from an additional year or two of experience. And so both in terms of how I approached my earlier life professionally and studies was becoming the best expert, the best technically competent, the best specialist around a specific subject matter or capability. And then very quickly I realized, no, I got to zoom out, and that is actually the sort of biggest value. And had I done that 20, 25 years earlier, I think I could have benefited from it. But who cares about me? But to your question, I think the read across for others is not to rely so much on just that expertise and narrowness and all that. And there are wonderful books that have written about these things and studies and a million other things.
Well, what continues to inspire you? Like, you know, as you're kind of moving into this, you know, the book is done, you're out there, like what inspires you in general, like, you know, beyond the confines of business too, I mean, that included, but what gives you that purpose and inspiration?
I mean, the biggest thing is really the potentiality and pathways for being a change maker and multiplying that for others, right? So the work we're doing, you know, whether it's individuals who go through courses, the feedback I get, or who read our stuff, or the aha moment for individuals or organizations in terms of opening the door to what I think is a survival mode for today's world. The changes we make in companies like Lux Carbon Standards or others we're working with. For me, this is what gives me hope. And to be honest, it's hard every day, right? I mean, you know, as much, if not better than me. It's hard to write. It's hard to get people to read, to sign up for courses, to pay for whatever. You know, every day is a ginormous challenge. But the thing that keeps me going is to realize that it is so needed, and that it can be helpful, if not necessary. And I wish it wasn't, because I'm not saying that I'm doing an amazing job to change the world, but I wish that the governance systems, incentive structures, the educational systems meant that you didn't need to go to someone who just discovered this 5-10 years ago and who's trying to roll it out. I wish that most people in the world would simply go to school and work for companies and read things and be aware of what operating system is required to stay relevant in today's world. But the reality is that for a number of reasons we can unpack, that is not the case. And so it does keep me going to see that hopefully it helps in a small way.
So the rapidity of change, you know, if you look over, you know, kind of now let's flash forward, we flash backwards, kind of what's in the present and the ghost of Christmas future. What is looking back on what you've like done? What's the impact? What do you hope it'll have on the world? Like, what do you want? How do you want to be remembered with the work you've done and the life, like that reflection? It's not just this epitaph, but it's more of just like, you know, the favorite beverage, just really a life well lived. You know, a purposeful career. Like, what are the things that you want to be remembered for? And when you would want to be proud of?
You know, there's a word which I fell in love with, which which I think is more important than anything. You come across words like innovation and disruption and successful and whatever you want. And the word, I think, which is really very meaningful to me is relevance, not just for me, but for humanity, for whatever. And to be and to stay relevant is difficult, right? It's a Darwinian world. It's like Alice in Wonderland. You need to. Yeah. So for me, that is really the word. If I can do something that is relevant for me, for my own sustainability, for my own economics, for my mindset, for the things I enjoy thinking about, and that also relevant in terms of relevance for the world, that is the biggest litmus test of anything. Are you relevant? Are your ideas relevant? And if you're not today, you can still be tomorrow. But if you are today, it doesn't mean you are tomorrow. So it's a brutal test that's constantly needs to be rolled out, tried, tested. It's a constant challenge, relevancy.
Yeah, it's a great perspective because I think relevancy, I don't think I've heard that from people. I've asked this question to a lot of people. And you're right. I see a lot of friends in the design space and other spaces, especially with automation, AI, that they have to retrain. What is their relevancy to like the next 5-10 years of their career? Maybe it's toward the end of their traditional career. Maybe it's a new one. It's interesting. I think that's a great way of framing it. So, as we kind of wrap it up, like, where do people find you? There's a lot of different things, and how can they learn more about the work and the new book, like, and order that, which I think is it's a great book.
So thanks for asking. I think, so the book is called Disrupt with Impact. If anybody Googles it, they'll find easy ways of buying it. If you want to learn more about it, there's a website, which is disruptwithimpact.com, which has reviews, a synopsis by chapter, a lot of articles, media, if people are just interested in learning about the topics, whether they wish to buy it or not. So that's Disrupt with Impact. LinkedIn is probably not a bad source for me. Follow the Disruptive Futures Institute or myself or both. And then if you Google Disruptive Futures Institute, you'll stumble upon a website. We have a YouTube channel. We have offerings. One thing I try to do is to have a lot out there that can be consumed for free for whatever level people wish. It can be an image, can be a visual, can be an illustration, can be a short post, can be a free article. So in our model, there is an element, I'm not pretending to be Mother Teresa or the Red Cross or anything, but there is a model whereby we generally try and share on the more generous side some of our ideas, frameworks, and tools, and have them available for whoever wants at any point.
That's great. Roger, thanks so much for being on the show today. It's been great having you on, and I know we have so much more we didn't even really get to. Another conversation is definitely in the future for us. But thanks, and thanks for being on.
No, thanks. I think Forward Podcast is an absolute favorite, Steve. Amazing what you're doing, and
Thank you.
My wish is that when we launch our own, to have you on, because the richness of your own experience and ideas and thoughts and your own upcoming books and a million other things. So hope to reciprocate very, very soon.
Very kind of you, and I look forward to it. So thanks a lot, and we'll talk next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Think Forward podcast. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms and at www.thinkforwardshow.com, as well as on YouTube under Think Forward Show. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the show. Now, about that thing I mentioned earlier about the book Super Shifts. Imagine having a playbook to navigate what's coming next. That's exactly why I wrote Super Shifts, to help you understand and prepare for the seismic changes shaping our world. Don't just react. Get ahead. Super Shifts is available now, wherever you get your books. And if you order today, you'll get exclusive bonus content. Head to supershiftsbook.com and grab your copy now and start future-proofing your life. The future won't wait. Why should you?